I trained for a year in the United States and then came back to England in beginning of '43, and then was fortunate enough to start flying the Typhoon, which at the time was the most powerful and fastest fighter in both air forces, I think. I never, I never wanted to be an architect. A very famous designer of the pre-war times, Vincent Corder, advised me to study architecture as a background for film design. My mother had a house in Hampstead, and by this time I was an expert on air raid shelters. I built a trench in our garden, but forgetting that the groundwater level was very high. And to cut a long story short, after a couple of weeks or 3 weeks, the whole air raid shelter collapsed, which was a disaster. It was my first architectural project. As far as design is concerned, I don't think the war had any influence in that sense, except that I let myself go, and also as a 60s approach, I felt very strongly that my designs had to be bigger than life, slightly tongue-in-cheek, but also reflect the time we were living in. So Dr. No gave me that opportunity. I played around a lot with metals, copper, gunmetal. Terence Young, the director, was the first one who came, and he loved the sets. They encouraged me enormously, and being encouraged that way, I really went all out. Stanley Kubrick called me after he had seen Dr. No and loved it, and asked me if I would be interested in designing his next film, a sort of comedy dealing with the nuclear destruction of the world, And he wanted me to come over straight away to discuss this project. And I went over to the Westbury, and we immediately hit it off. It was amazing, And I thought, this is going to be a piece of cake. Everybody says this genial young director is unbelievably difficult to work with. And I was scribbling some ideas, and he loved the ideas immediately. And I thought, I don't know what everybody's talking about. Little did I know. He did say, the director's right to change his mind until the cameras started turning. But I learned later that he changed his mind many times after the cameras had started turning. But every time he changed his mind, it was for the better. No question about that. After 3 weeks, he said one morning to me, you've got to come up with a different design. I wasn't really experienced enough at that time. And I nearly flipped, and I took a walk in the very beautiful gardens at Shepperton Studios and took a Valium or something like that. And once I calmed down in my cubbyhole, I started sketching again. But Kubrick was standing behind me. And when I came up with this triangular shape, he said, hold it for a minute, Isn't the triangle the strongest geometric form? And I didn't really know, but I said, of course, Stanley. And then he said, well, how are you going to treat the wall surfaces? And I said, as reinforced concrete. So he said, like a gigantic bomb shelter. I said, yes. And that sold him. And one thing you'll find in most of my designs, I always somehow introduce a circle somewhere. and thought it would make an interesting table for the general staff and the President of the United States to sit around. And he said, wait a moment, that table you can cover in green felt, was a black and white picture. He said, well, I want the audience to feel like they're playing for the fate of the world, like a poker game, you know. And at the same time came up with another circle, which was like a lighting ring, suspended lighting ring. And Kubrick just loved it. And so we spent days together, myself sitting in a chair and he holding up photo floods to decide which is the best angle to light these actors with. The whole scene in the war room was lit from that ring. You know, with these reflections, you didn't believe at times you were in reality, and but it had the right effect. And I never forget Terry Southern, the writer, who the first time he came on the set, but he had a great sense of humor. He said, well, looks interesting, Ken, but will it dress? The vision of the war room was purely something that I invented because I didn't have any real reference. I believed that I could create with a set which does not reflect reality a more realistic acceptance by the audience than by designing something very realistically. And when Ronald Reagan became President of the United States, he asked his chief of staff to be shown the war room of Dr. Strangelove, because he believed it was somewhere in the Pentagon or so on. And that is really a true story. You know? About 5 years ago, I was invited to LA to pay a tribute to Stanley Kubrick shortly after his death. Steven Spielberg came to see me and he said, Ken, I've never met you before, but I always wanted to tell you that the war room in Dr. Strangelove is the best set you ever designed, and I think the best set that has ever been designed for